The chandeliers threw light like scattered diamonds across marble floors, too pristine for my second-hand heels. I didn't belong here. The thought circled my mind as I stood in the entrance of Aurelio's, the kind of restaurant where reservations required 3 months' notice and connections I'd never possess, clutching my worn purse against the silk blouse I'd borrowed from Lucy. My sister had insisted, her voice bright with that manic enthusiasm that always preceded her worst ideas, that this blind date would change my life. Standing here now, surrounded by old money and the kind of casual wealth that felt like a foreign language, I wanted to murder her. The maitre d' appeared at my elbow, his expression politely expectant, and I gave Lucy's mystery man's name with a confidence I absolutely did not feel. Alex. Just Alex. No last name. No details. Just my sister's promise that he was successful and interested, and exactly what I needed after 2 years of voluntary solitude. The maitre d's face shifted into something I couldn't quite read. A flicker of surprise or perhaps alarm before the professional mask resettled. He guided me through the dining room where conversations hushed momentarily as we passed, and I felt each glance like a physical touch. Then I saw him. He rose from a corner table that commanded a view of the entire restaurant, and the breath simply left my body. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair swept back from a face too angular to be classically handsome, but arresting in its severe beauty. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled, and eyes so dark they appeared black in the low light. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, charcoal gray and perfectly tailored to shoulders that suggested either dedicated gym time or a profession that required physical strength. When those eyes locked onto mine, something electric shot down my spine. Fear and attraction tangled together until I couldn't separate one from the other. He moved around the table with a predator's grace, and I noticed the maitre d' had vanished like smoke. Alex extended his hand. Eleanor. His voice was low, controlled, with an accent I couldn't place smoothing the edges of my name into something exotic. I'm glad you came. His hand enveloped mine, warm and calloused in unexpected places, and I saw it then, the scar running across his knuckles, white and raised and violent in its history. He held my hand a fraction too long, his thumb brushing across my wrist where my pulse hammered visibly, and when he smiled, it didn't reach those impossibly dark eyes. Please, sit. I sat because my legs had stopped reliably supporting me. He settled across from me with the careful economy of movement that suggested constant awareness of his body and space, and I realized with creeping unease that he'd positioned himself with his back to the wall, his gaze able to sweep the entire room with a slight turn of his head. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. I settled back into the chair against every instinct screaming at me to run, my hands twisting the cloth napkin in my lap into a rope of wrinkled linen. Alex watched me with those unreadable dark eyes, and when the waiter appeared with wine I hadn't ordered, something expensive and red that caught the light like blood, I realized the entire evening had been choreographed without my input. He lifted his glass in a silent toast, waited for me to mirror the gesture, and the crystal sang when they touched. Your work at the museum must be fascinating, he said, his voice carrying that same controlled warmth that felt calculated. The Byzantine collection especially. You've been working on the new acquisition for what, 2 weeks now? The Theodora medallion. Cold washed through me. I hadn't mentioned my work. Lucy knew I was a curator, but not the specific projects, not the details of the 6th century medallion that had consumed my last 14 days. How do you know about that? I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. He smiled, and this time something almost genuine flickered in his expression. I make it my business to know things, Eleanor, especially about people who interest me. The way he said my name, like he'd been saying it for years, like he had ownership of the syllables, made my skin prickle. I set down my glass with enough force that wine sloshed against the sides. What else do you know? Everything worth knowing. You leave your apartment at 7:15 every morning, stop at the coffee shop on Marlow Street where you order the same vanilla latte, arrive at the museum by 8. You work through lunch most days. You visit your sister every Thursday evening, and you worry about her constantly. You should. The last words dropped like stones into still water. I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loud enough to draw glances from nearby diners. This was insane. He was insane. I needed to leave, needed to call Lucy, needed to understand what kind of psychopath she'd set me up with. I made it 3 steps before his hand closed around my wrist. Not painful, but utterly immovable. And he was standing so close I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive with notes of cedar and smoke. "Please," he said quietly, "sit down. Give me 1 hour to explain. Then if you want to leave, I won't stop you. But you need to hear this." The restaurant had gone silent around us. Or maybe that was just my perception narrowing to the point of contact where his fingers pressed against my pulse. I looked up into his face and saw something there that terrified me more than the control or the knowledge or the obvious danger. I saw certainty. He knew something I didn't, something that had already changed everything. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. "To keep you alive," he said simply, and guided me back to the table with the inexorable pressure of a man who expected obedience and received it. I sat. He released my wrist, and I saw the white marks where his fingers had been, felt the ghost of his touch burning into my skin. "You've been under my protection for 3 weeks, Eleanor. You just didn't know it." "Protection from what?" I managed, and my voice sounded thin and distant, like it belonged to someone else standing very far away. Alex leaned back in his chair with that same predatory ease, his fingers drumming once against the table in a rhythm that felt deliberate. "Your sister Lucy borrowed money from the wrong people 6 months ago. Gambling debts. She got in deep with a loan operation run by Robert Crawford. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it, flat and cold, suggested it should. Crawford owns the North Docks and everything that moves through them. Drugs, weapons, people. He's expanding south into my territory, and he's not particular about his methods. When Lucy couldn't pay, he started looking for alternative collections. You. The word hit me like a fist to the sternum. Me. What does that mean? It means Crawford decided your sister's debt transfers to you. You're more valuable, educated, employed, respectable. You have things he can use. Access to the museum's wealthy donors, security codes, shipping manifests for valuable acquisitions. Or simpler than that. You're young and beautiful, and he has buyers for women who fit that description. The casual way he laid out my potential destruction, like he was discussing weather patterns or stock portfolios, made bile rise in my throat. "I need to call Lucy," I said, reaching for my purse with shaking hands. "He's lying. He has to be lying. This is some elaborate manipulation for reasons I can't understand, but Lucy will explain. Lucy will tell me this is insane." Alex produced his phone before I could find mine, slid it across the table and tapped the screen. Photographs loaded, crisp and clear and horrifying. Lucy leaving her apartment building. A man in a dark jacket 10 feet behind her. Lucy at the grocery store. The same man visible through the window. Lucy at the bus stop. 2 different men now, bracketing her on the bench. The timestamps ran across the last 9 days. "I'm going to be sick," I whispered. Crawford made his intentions clear 3 weeks ago when his men tried to grab you outside the museum after that evening lecture on Byzantine iconography. My men stopped it. You never knew because that's how protection works when it's done correctly. Since then, you've had a shadow everywhere you go. Thomas Whitmore, my second, has personally overseen your security. He felt the weight of this statement, expected me to be grateful perhaps, but all I felt was violated and terrified and trapped. "Why do you care?" I asked. "What am I to you?" "Nothing, until Crawford made you something. This territory is mine, Eleanor. The port district, the warehouses, the shipping lanes. I've held it for 8 years against men more dangerous than Crawford. When he comes into my area and puts his hands on someone under my protection, it's not about you anymore. It's about power and respect and making clear that what's mine stays mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have repelled me, but instead it sparked something hot and confusing in my chest. You're saying I'm yours now? A statement, not a question. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt physical. For as long as Crawford thinks you're valuable, yes. Stay close to me, and he won't touch you. Fight me, and you'll end up in a container ship, headed somewhere you don't want to go. I refused to let him send me home like a child dismissed from adult conversations, insisted on going to my own apartment, where at least the walls were mine, and the locks answered to my keys. And Alex finally nodded with that same calculating assessment that made me feel simultaneously protected and catalogued. Thomas Whitmore materialized from somewhere near the bar. A man in his 40s with gray threading his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. And the drive to my modest apartment building in his black SUV felt like a funeral procession. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort or explain, just drove with the competent efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, delivered frightened women to temporary safety while worse things unfolded in shadows. My apartment looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, the coffee cup still in the sink, the book still open on the couch, but everything felt contaminated now by knowledge I couldn't unknow. Thomas did a sweep that was thorough and professional, checking windows and sightlines in places I'd never considered vulnerabilities, then positioned himself outside my door with the clear intention of staying there all night. I locked myself inside and stood in the center of my living room. This space I'd furnished carefully over years with thrift store finds and museum gift shop prints, and felt it all dissolving like sugar in rain. My phone sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. 3 missed calls from Lucy, and I couldn't bring myself to call her back because what would I even say? Your gambling debt just sold me to the Mafia. A crime lord wants to traffic me. I'm apparently property in a territorial dispute between monsters. The words felt absurd, impossible, but the weight of Alex's hand on my wrist had been real. The photos of Lucy being followed had been real, and the cold certainty in his voice when he discussed violence had been terrifyingly real. I tried to sleep, but every sound became a threat, every shadow a potential intruder, and I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed the evening in excruciating detail. The way Alex had looked at me across that table, not like I was prey exactly, but like I was something valuable he'd already decided to keep. The scar on his hand, pale against tanned skin, suggesting a history of violence he wore as casually as his expensive watch. The gentleness in his touch when he'd guided me back to my seat, the contradiction of a man who spoke about murder with the same tone he used to order wine. I should have been planning escape, calling the police, doing something rational and self-preserving. Instead, I found myself remembering the heat of his fingers on my skin, the way his eyes had softened fractionally when he'd said he wanted to keep me alive, like my survival mattered to him beyond strategy and territory. It was insane. I was developing some kind of Stockholm syndrome before I'd even been officially kidnapped. But as dawn light crept through my curtains and I heard Thomas shift position outside my door, I realized the trap had already closed, and I'd walked into it the moment I'd sat back down at that table and decided to listen. Lucy arrived just after 8 in the morning, her key still working in my lock because I'd never asked for it back after our parents died, and she'd needed somewhere safe to fall apart. She looked terrible, eyes swollen and red, her hair unwashed, wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in 2 days ago. And the guilt and fear radiating off her was so palpable I could taste it metallic and bitter in the air between us. "I'm so sorry," she started, and then she was sobbing, the kind of ugly, desperate crying that shakes your whole body, and despite the fury burning in my chest, I pulled her inside before Thomas could see her falling apart in my doorway. She confessed everything in a torrent of words that tripped over each other. The poker games that started casual then turned serious. The friend who knew a guy who ran a private high-stakes room. The wins that felt like destiny until the losses started mounting faster than she could track. The moment she realized she was $47,000 in debt to men who didn't accept payment plans or excuses. She'd tried to fix it, doubled down thinking she could win it back, only dug herself deeper until Crawford's people came to collect, and she'd begged for time, and they'd smiled and said they'd find another way for her to pay. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, and demand how she could be so reckless, so stupid, so selfish. But she looked so broken and small curled on my couch that all I could do was hold her while my own fear crystallized into something sharp and cold. "They came to see me yesterday," she whispered into my shoulder. "Crawford's men. They said you were prettier than me, more valuable, that you had access to rich people and expensive things. They said my debt would be forgiven if I convinced you to have dinner with a client, just one dinner. And I told them to go to hell, but they knew where you worked and what time you left and what route you walked home. They described your blue coat, the one with the silver buttons. They'd been watching you." The knowledge slithered down my spine like ice water, violated and exposed, and I understood with sickening clarity that Alex had been telling the truth about everything. My phone rang, an unknown number, and when I answered, his voice was calm and absolute. "Eleanor, Crawford made a move last night. His men tried to take you outside your building around 2 in the morning. Thomas stopped them, but this escalates now. You need to come to my estate immediately." Lucy grabbed my arm, shaking her head frantically, whispering, "No, no, no, you can't go to him. He's dangerous." But what choice did I have when the alternative was Crawford's container ship and a destination I'd never return from? Thomas knocked 8 minutes later, his expression grim and professional. And the drive north into the hills revealed a world I'd only glimpsed in magazines. Estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates, old money and new power intertwined, until we turned onto a private road that wound through manicured grounds to a house that looked like it belonged in European aristocracy, not American crime, all limestone and tall windows and security cameras tracking our approach, while men with earpieces and concealed weapons watched from strategic positions, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was entering a gilded cage that might never open again. The first 3 days passed in a strange suspension of reality, time moving differently in this estate that existed outside normal rules. And my museum called on the second morning with concern about my sudden absence. My supervisor leaving a voicemail asking if everything was all right and when I'd be returning. But before I could figure out how to explain the unexplainable, Alexander handled it with a single phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear, his voice smooth and authoritative as he spoke to someone who clearly had the power to grant extended personal leave without questions asked. And I hated him in that moment for how effortlessly he manipulated my world, reached into my carefully built life and rearranged it like chess pieces on a board only he could see. But I also noticed things in those suspended days, details that accumulated despite my resistance, like how he took calls in Russian and Italian, switching between languages with the fluency of someone who'd grown up in multiple worlds, how his men treated him with a respect that seemed genuine rather than the fear I'd expected, how Thomas deferred to his judgment, but also pushed back when he disagreed, and Alexander actually listened, and how he worked brutal 18-hour days managing an empire I was only beginning to understand the scope of, logistics and shipping manifests, and territorial negotiations that happened in coded language over secure phone lines. I found him in his study, late on the fourth night, unable to sleep again, because my body still hadn't adjusted to the hypervigilance of living surrounded by armed men and security systems. And his door was open just slightly, lamplight spilling into the dark hallway, and when I pushed it wider, he looked up from the papers spread across his massive desk, with exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He should have looked diminished by fatigue, but somehow he just looked more human, the controlled mask slipping enough that I could see the man underneath carrying weight that would crush most people. We talked, really talked for the first time without the urgency of immediate danger, and he told me about inheriting his father's organization at 22 when a rival's bullet found its target, about the choice that wasn't really a choice between stepping into blood-soaked shoes or watching everything his family built dissolve into chaos and violence that would consume innocent people in the crossfire, about learning to be ruthless because mercy in his world was interpreted as weakness, and weakness got people killed. He shouldn't have been telling me any of this, was violating his own rules about operational security and compartmentalized information. But something in the late hour and his exhaustion and the way I sat across from him without judgment made the words spill out like confession, and I shouldn't have sympathized because he was still a criminal who made choices that destroyed lives. But I did, understanding with uncomfortable clarity that morality looked different when survival was the baseline, and every choice was just degrees of terrible. When he finally stood, stretching muscles clearly stiff from hours at that desk, and offered to walk me back to my room, his hand settled at the small of my back with a casualness that felt earned somehow, and the touch burned through the thin silk of the pajamas he'd had delivered along with an entire wardrobe in my size, because apparently he thought of everything, and we walked through the silent house in a charged quiet that felt more intimate than any conversation. And when we reached my door, he hesitated for just a moment, his eyes dark and unreadable, before stepping back with visible effort and wishing me good night in a voice gone rough with something I was afraid to name. Thomas found me in the conservatory on the 6th morning, a room I'd discovered filled with light and green growing things that felt like the only honest space in this estate of secrets and locked doors. And he sat down across from me without asking permission, his presence less intimidating than I'd initially thought, more weary soldier than threatening enforcer. "You want to understand him," Thomas said without preamble, and it wasn't a question, so I didn't answer, just waited while he chose his words carefully, like someone navigating a minefield of loyalty and truth. "Alexander operates in a world most people don't see, the infrastructure that keeps cities running, the ports where cargo moves in and out, the supply chains that put food on tables and products in stores, and yes, some of it exists in legal gray zones, but he maintains order in spaces where chaos would consume everything." He told me about Crawford, about the human trafficking routes Crawford had tried to establish through the port district 3 years ago, about the shipment of 23 women and girls that Alexander had intercepted and turned over to federal authorities anonymously, about the drug pipelines Crawford pushed that Alexander blocked because he'd watched his younger brother die of an overdose at 16 and refused to profit from that particular destruction. "I'm not saying he's a saint," Thomas continued, his eyes steady and honest. "He's done things that would make you sick, made choices that cost lives, but he operates with a code, and he keeps monsters like Crawford from turning this city into a hunting ground." I wanted to reject the moral complexity, to insist that crime was crime and violence was violence, but I'd studied enough history to know that power vacuums filled with whoever was ruthless enough to claim them. And if Alexander's control prevented worse atrocities, then what did that make him? And what did it make me for starting to accept it? That afternoon, the news came through encrypted channels that Thomas monitored. One of Alexander's warehouses hit in a coordinated strike. 2 men injured and hundreds of thousands in product destroyed. And I watched Alexander transform into someone I barely recognized, cold and precise as he deployed resources and issued commands in a voice that expected absolute obedience. He was terrifying in his efficiency, a strategist who saw 10 moves ahead and had contingencies for every scenario. And I understood why men followed him and why enemies feared him. That night my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, just a photo. And when I opened it, my entire world inverted, because it was Lucy walking to her car outside the rehabilitation center I'd helped her check into. Except the angle was wrong. Taken from across the street with the clear implication that someone was watching her, someone close enough to hurt her. I must have made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, because suddenly Alexander was there, taking the phone from my shaking hands, his expression going deadly still as he studied the image. Then his arms were around me for the first time without hesitation or pretense, pulling me against the solid warmth of his chest, and I could feel his heartbeat steady and strong beneath my cheek, while my own heart was trying to break through my ribs with terror. "I will keep her safe," he said into my hair, his voice absolutely certain, carrying the weight of a promise that wasn't just words but a fundamental reorganization of his priorities. I shouldn't have believed him. This man who lived in violence and commanded criminals. But I did with a conviction that bypassed logic entirely, and I held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and treacherous beneath my feet. Alexander moved within 20 minutes of holding me, his transformation from comforting protector to tactical commander so swift it left me breathless. And suddenly the study filled with men receiving rapid instructions in voices too low for me to fully hear. But I caught enough to understand that Lucy was being extracted now, tonight, before Crawford realized his threat had been discovered. "I'm coming with you," I said, and the room went silent. 6 sets of eyes swinging to me before landing on Alexander, whose expression closed immediately into something immovable. "No," he said simply, as if that single word ended the discussion. But I'd spent 28 years raising a sister who tested every boundary, and I knew how to fight battles that mattered. "She's my sister, and I'm not staying here safe while she's in danger because of me," I pushed back, hearing my voice shake but holding his stare anyway, and something flickered in those dark eyes, surprise maybe, or recognition that I wasn't going to fold. "Eleanor," he started, then stopped, and I saw it, the fear beneath all that control, the same terror I felt but manifesting as the need to keep me contained and protected. "We can't risk you," Thomas interjected, his tone reasonable but firm. "If Crawford has people watching your sister and they see you, it escalates everything." "Then I stay in the car," I compromised, watching Alexander's jaw clench. "I wear whatever tracking device you want. I follow every instruction, but I need to be there when Lucy arrives. She'll be terrified and she needs to see me." The silence stretched while Alexander calculated risks and probabilities, and I could see the war in his expression between the strategist, who knew I was a liability, and the man who was beginning to understand that controlling me wasn't protection, it was suffocation. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and decisive, but his conditions were absolute. Tracker embedded in a bracelet he locked around my wrist himself. I stayed in the vehicle with Thomas at all times. And if anything went wrong, I followed evacuation protocols without question. The operation itself was almost anticlimactic in its precision. 40 minutes of driving through the city to the rehabilitation center where Lucy had checked herself in 3 weeks ago trying to get clean, and then watching through tinted windows as 4 of Alexander's men moved with choreographed efficiency. 2 entering the building, while 2 secured the perimeter, and within 12 minutes, Lucy emerged between them looking small and confused, and so achingly young that my throat closed. When they brought her to the SUV and she saw me, her face crumpled, and I pulled her into my arms while she sobbed apologies into my shoulder. And over her head, I met Alexander's eyes where he stood outside, his expression unreadable, but something like approval in the slight nod he gave me before turning to sweep the area with the vigilance of someone who trusted nothing. Back at the estate, Lucy clung to me while I explained everything, the debt and Crawford and Alexander's protection, watching her process the impossible reality that her mistakes had dragged us both into a criminal war. But Alexander's expression when he returned from securing the perimeter was grim, the set of his shoulders carrying tension that made my stomach drop. "Crawford will retaliate for this," he said quietly, looking at me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "He considers your sister his leverage, and we just took her. This becomes personal now." "How personal?" I asked, and his silence was more terrifying than any answer. That evening, I found him on the terrace, overlooking grounds, now crawling with additional security, the sun setting in violent shades of orange and red that seemed appropriate for the mood. And when I approached, he didn't turn, but his body shifted slightly toward me in acknowledgement. "I'll end this soon," he said to the horizon, his voice carrying a finality that raised every hair on my neck. What does that mean? I asked, though part of me already knew, and when he didn't answer, I stepped closer, close enough to feel his heat, and did something I'd been wanting to do since that first night when he'd walked me to my room. I reached up and touched his face, my palm against the stubble-rough jaw, feeling the warmth of his skin and the tension in the muscle beneath. And he finally turned to look at me with eyes so full of dark promise and barely leashed violence that I should have been terrified. But instead, I felt safe, chosen, claimed in ways I didn't have words for yet. The touch on the terrace changed everything between us. An invisible line crossed that neither of us could uncross, and for the next 3 days, Alexander avoided me with such deliberate precision that I felt his absence like a physical ache in spaces we'd previously shared. I found myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway outside my room, lingering in the library where we'd talked until 3 in the morning about Byzantine art and the philosophy of power, wandering to the study where I'd found him exhausted and unguarded. But he was never there, always in meetings or on calls or locked away in parts of the estate I didn't have access to. The wanting was a constant hum beneath my skin, distracting and inappropriate and utterly undeniable, and I caught myself replaying that moment on the terrace in obsessive detail. The heat of his skin under my palm, the way his eyes had gone dark and hungry, the tension in his body like a wire pulled taut before snapping. On the fourth night, I couldn't sleep, restless energy driving me from bed at 2 in the morning to wander downstairs in bare feet and silk pajamas. And I heard it before I saw anything. The sound of a piano played with technical perfection, but also deep feeling. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, drifting through the quiet house like a confession. I followed the music to a room I'd never entered before, a small, intimate space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit grounds. And there was Alexander at a grand piano, his jacket discarded and shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, playing with his eyes closed, and an expression of such unguarded pain that I froze in the doorway, afraid to breathe. When the piece ended, the silence felt sacred, and I should have left, but instead I stepped inside, and his eyes opened immediately, finding me across the room with an intensity that made my heart stutter. "I didn't know you played," I said quietly, and he studied me for a long moment before answering. "My mother taught me before she died. It's the only thing I do that doesn't involve calculating angles or managing violence." "Come here," he said. And it wasn't a command, but a request, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard from him. And I crossed the distance to stand beside the piano, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face and the conflict in his eyes. He told me then about his childhood, a mother who loved art and music trapped in a world of brutality, a father who saw sentiment as weakness, a younger brother whose death at 16 from an overdose had carved out something essential from Alexander's chest that never healed. I shared pieces of myself I'd kept locked away the night my parents died in a car accident, and I became Lucy's guardian at 19, the years of struggling to keep us afloat while finishing my degree, the loneliness of responsibility that made connection feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. "We were mirrors," he said quietly, shaped by duty and sacrifice, and the weight of keeping others alive. The air between us thickened with unspoken want, and I saw the moment he decided to stop fighting it, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck and pull me down to him, and then his mouth was on mine, hot and demanding and desperate, consuming me with a hunger that matched my own. He kissed me like I was oxygen and he was drowning, his other hand fisting in my hair, and I responded with everything I had, climbing into his lap on the piano bench, my legs bracketing his hips, feeling him hard against me through too many layers of clothing. Then suddenly he was pulling away, breathing hard, his hands on my shoulders holding me at a distance, while his eyes blazed with want and frustration. "I can't do this," he said roughly. "Not while you're here because you have no other choice. Not while you're dependent on me for safety. This has to be real, or it's just me taking advantage. I'm choosing this," I argued, my voice shaking. "I'm choosing you." and his expression was anguished. "When you're free," he said with absolute finality, "when Crawford is gone and you can walk away from me without consequences. If you still want this, then I'll give you everything, but not before, not like this." I woke the next morning to raised voices filtering through the estate, Thomas and another man arguing in Russian somewhere on the lower floor, and when I found Lucy in the breakfast room, she looked pale and exhausted, barely touching the food on her plate. Alexander had been in meetings since 5 in the morning, according to the staff member who poured my coffee, strategic sessions with his most trusted people, and the tension in the house felt like static electricity before a lightning strike, everyone moving with heightened alertness and barely suppressed energy. I spent the day trying to distract Lucy and myself, showing her the library and the gardens, but my mind kept drifting to Alexander, and whatever was being planned behind closed doors. And by evening, when Thomas found me and said Alexander wanted to see me in his study, my stomach dropped with premonition. He was standing by the window when I entered, still in the clothes from morning, looking at something on his phone with an expression that made my blood run cold. And when he turned to me, I saw the decision already made in his eyes, the resignation of someone about to walk into fire. "Crawford has demanded a meeting," he said without preamble, neutral ground, just the two of us to discuss terms. The words hit me like a physical blow because I'd spent enough time around Thomas to understand what neutral ground meant in this world, a fiction of safety that depended entirely on honor among people who had none. "You can't go," I said immediately. "It's a trap. He won't honor any agreement." Alexander's expression was patient but immovable. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's the only way to end this. If I refuse, he escalates, and more people die. Your sister remains a target. You remain a target." The logic was sound, but my entire body rejected it, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that I was about to lose something I'd only just found. "There has to be another way," I insisted, hearing desperation creep into my voice. "You can't just walk into an ambush." His jaw tightened and he crossed to me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, and what I saw in his face stole my breath, a tenderness and fierce protectiveness, and something deeper that neither of us had named yet. "This is the only way to free you and Lucy," he said, his hand coming up to cup my face with devastating gentleness. "Crawford won't stop until one of us is dead or gone, and I won't let him have you." The depth of feeling in those words, the absolute certainty that he would die to keep me safe, crashed over me like a wave, and suddenly I understood, with perfect clarity, that this man who'd kidnapped me into protection and controlled every aspect of my life for weeks had given me something no one else ever had, the security of being someone's absolute priority, and I was looking at someone willing to sacrifice everything for that promise. I kissed him before I could think, before fear could stop me, pouring everything I couldn't say into the press of my mouth against his. A plea and a promise, and a desperate attempt to anchor him to this moment, to me, to life. He responded with controlled desperation, his hands fisting in my hair, pulling me closer like he could memorize me through touch. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the small space we'd created. "I have to do this," he whispered, and I heard the apology in it, the regret for what he was about to put me through. When he finally pulled away, I watched him walk to his desk and have a quiet conversation with Thomas, who'd appeared in the doorway, watched him give instructions, in that calm, authoritative voice, and my heart was breaking because I could see the goodbye in every gesture. Thomas looked at me once, his expression grim, and I knew Alexander was leaving contingencies, plans for if he didn't return, and the terror clawing up my throat threatened to choke me. "Eleanor," Alexander said, drawing my attention back to him, his eyes intense and blazing with everything unspoken between us. "If I don't come back, Thomas will get you and Lucy new identities, money, a fresh start far from here." I wanted to scream that I didn't want a fresh start without him, but the words lodged in my chest, and instead I watched him walk out of the study toward whatever end Crawford had planned. And I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't let him do this alone, that loving him meant fighting for him even when he'd ordered me to stay safe. I couldn't lose him. I wouldn't. I made my choice in the 10 minutes after Alexander left the study, my heart hammering against my ribs as I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and scrolled through contacts to find the number I'd saved 2 years ago and never thought I'd use. Dr. Sarah Chen from my brief consulting work at the Metropolitan Museum, whose brother James was an FBI agent who'd told me once over drinks that if I ever needed anything to call him because I'd saved his sister's career when a provenance dispute nearly destroyed her reputation. My fingers trembled as I dialed, and when a professional male voice answered with Agent Chen, I nearly lost my nerve. But then I thought of Alexander walking into Crawford's trap, and the words tumbled out in a desperate rush. I need help, and I have information on Robert Crawford, and I'm willing to testify in exchange for protection and immunity for someone who can help you bring him down. The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats before Agent Chen said, "Tell me everything," and I did. The whole impossible story spilling out about Lucy's debt and Crawford's threats and Alexander's protection and the meeting happening right now that was going to end with someone dead. I offered Alexander up as a cooperating witness, someone with inside knowledge of Crawford's operations who could provide evidence the FBI had been trying to get for years. And I heard the shift in Agent Chen's voice when I mentioned Crawford's name. The sharp attention of a hunter catching a scent, because apparently Robert Crawford was their white whale, the target they'd been pursuing for 5 years through 3 states and countless bodies. Within 40 minutes, there were 4 federal agents in Alexander's study, and Thomas had appeared with murder in his eyes, demanding to know what I'd done. And I stood my ground and explained that this was the only way to save Alexander's life, that Crawford would never honor neutral ground, but the FBI could intercede and take them both down, and maybe, just maybe, we could all survive this. Thomas looked at me like I was insane and said, "Alexander will kill me for allowing this," but I saw the calculation in his expression and knew he understood the logic even as he hated it. The agents worked fast, tracking Alexander's phone location to an abandoned warehouse complex by the docks on the east side, mobilizing tactical units and coordinating with local police. And when I said I was coming with them, Agent Chen refused immediately. "Absolutely not. You're a civilian and a witness we need to protect." I waited until they were loading into vehicles, and then I slipped into the back of Thomas's SUV while he was arguing with the agent in charge, pressing myself into the floor behind the front seats and staying silent until we were already moving. And when Thomas discovered me 10 minutes into the drive, he unleashed a string of Russian curses that needed no translation. But he didn't turn back because we both heard it then, the distant pop of gunfire carried on the night air, and my heart stopped completely as Thomas accelerated and the FBI vehicles ahead of us lit up with sirens, and the world narrowed to a single desperate prayer that we weren't too late. The warehouse exploded with chaos as FBI tactical units swarmed through entrances I hadn't even seen, their shouts of federal agents and get down mixing with the sharp reports of gunfire that made my ears ring and my heart slam against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack bone. Thomas had his hand locked around my arm trying to pull me back behind the vehicle, but I wrenched free and ran toward the warehouse entrance, driven by pure terror and the need to see with my own eyes whether Alexander was alive or dead, and then I saw him through the smoke and darkness, standing near an overturned table with blood soaking through his shirt sleeve and his gun trained on a figure on the ground. Crawford. Even subdued and surrounded, Robert Crawford looked dangerous, his face twisted with rage as 3 agents moved in to cuff him. And the relief that crashed through me, seeing Alexander upright and breathing, nearly took my legs out from under me. Our eyes met across the chaos, across the armed agents and Crawford's men being forced to their knees, and the debris of what had clearly been a firefight. And what I saw in Alexander's face was a complicated storm of relief and fury and something almost like betrayal that I'd disobeyed his orders and put myself anywhere near this violence. An agent tried to redirect me back outside, but I pushed past, needing to reach Alexander, and when I got close enough to see the blood was real, and the exhaustion in his eyes went bone deep. I wanted to touch him, but suddenly wasn't sure if I had the right, if bringing the FBI into his world without permission had broken something fundamental between us. Thomas appeared at Alexander's side speaking rapid Russian, and Alexander responded without taking his eyes off me, his expression unreadable. And then the agents were separating us, taking Alexander for questioning in one direction, while Agent Chen materialized beside me saying we needed to get my statement now while events were fresh. The next 6 hours dissolved into fluorescent lights and repeated questions, me explaining the timeline over and over, while Chen and his partner took notes and recorded everything, occasionally leaving to confer with other agents before returning with more questions about Crawford's threats and Alexander's organization, and what I knew about criminal operations I'd only barely glimpsed. My deal held, though, Chen assured me of that. Eleanor, you gave us Crawford, and that's worth more than you know. We've been trying to build a case against him for 5 years, and your testimony plus Tremaine's cooperation gives us everything we need. When they finally released me, it was nearly dawn, Thomas waiting in the hallway looking haggard, and he drove me back to the estate in silence that felt heavy with judgment, until he finally said, Alexander's being released with restrictions and monitoring, partial immunity on specific charges in exchange for cooperation, and I couldn't tell from his tone whether he thought I'd saved Alexander's life or destroyed it. The estate felt different when we arrived, less like a fortress, and more like a house holding its breath, and I went to Alexander's study to wait, because I knew that's where he'd go first. And when he finally walked through the door 40 minutes later, looking exhausted and bandaged with his shirt changed but blood still visible at the edges of the white gauze on his arm, the fury in his eyes hit me like a physical force. You could have been killed, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You ran into an active firefight. Do you have any concept of what could have happened? And I stood my ground and said I saved your life. You were walking into a trap, and you know it. He couldn't argue with that truth, but the anger didn't fade. It transformed into something rawer, fear and relief tangled together, and he asked the question I'd been dreading. Why did you risk everything? Why did you bring the FBI into this? Why couldn't you just stay safe like I asked? The answer rose up from somewhere deep and undeniable, simple and world-changing and utterly terrifying to speak aloud. Because I love you, I said. And the words hung between us like a confession and a declaration of war against every logical reason I should walk away from this man and this impossible situation. The anger drained from his expression, replaced by something vulnerable and almost awed, and he crossed the study in 3 strides, his hands framing my face with desperate gentleness, before his mouth found mine in a kiss that tasted like fear and relief and promises we'd never dared to make before. No more restraint or careful distance or gentleman's resolve keeping us apart. Just the truth that we'd chosen each other despite every reason not to, and that choice had remade us both into something new and fragile and impossibly strong. The following weeks reshaped our world in ways I couldn't have anticipated during those desperate hours at the warehouse when I thought I might lose him before we'd even begun. Alexander started the complex process of legitimizing his operations with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once applied to criminal enterprise, meeting with lawyers and accountants and federal monitors who appeared at the estate with regularity that felt intrusive but necessary. And I watched him systematically dismantle his father's legacy piece by piece, keeping the shipping and logistics operations that had always operated in legal gray zones and divesting the protection rackets and gambling operations and anything that couldn't withstand government scrutiny. It was painful for him. I could see it in the tension around his eyes during late-night calls with associates who felt betrayed by his cooperation with federal authorities, in the way his jaw tightened when Thomas reported another old connection had severed ties rather than risk association with someone now under FBI monitoring. But he never wavered, and when I found him in his study at 2 in the morning, staring at contracts that would transfer territory his father had died defending to competitors who'd once been enemies. I sat beside him, and he took my hand and said, "This is worth it. You're worth it." And I believed him, even as I felt the weight of what my choice had cost him. Lucy entered a residential treatment program for gambling addiction 10 days after Crawford's arrest, finally ready to address the demons that had nearly destroyed us both. And saying goodbye to her at the facility was harder than I'd expected, watching my baby sister, who I'd raised and protected, walk through those doors to face truths she'd been running from for years. I returned to the museum after 6 weeks away, my colleagues politely not asking too many questions about my extended personal leave, though I caught the curious looks and whispered speculation, and diving back into Renaissance pottery fragments and provenance documentation felt simultaneously comforting in its normalcy and absurdly trivial compared to the life and death stakes I'd been navigating. Alexander and I learned to exist together in the real world, no longer operating in crisis mode where every decision was about survival, and it was awkward and tender and sometimes frustrating in ways the heightened intensity of danger had obscured. He was used to absolute control, making decisions unilaterally and expecting compliance, while I'd built my adult life on hard-won independence and refused to become decorative or deferential just because we were together. We clashed over small things that revealed deeper tensions, like when he assigned security to follow me to work without asking, and I told him in no uncertain terms that I wouldn't live under surveillance in my own life, or when I made plans with museum colleagues for drinks, and he appeared personally to collect me because he didn't trust the neighborhood after dark. We learned to compromise, him gradually loosening his protective instincts, and me accepting that some precautions were reasonable, given his past still cast long shadows. His history didn't vanish just because the FBI had granted limited immunity. Old associates still sought him out asking for favors or counsel, debts and obligations from years of operating in criminal hierarchies that couldn't be dissolved with paperwork and good intentions. I learned to live with the gray morality of it, accepting that the man I loved had done things I could never fully reconcile with my own values, but choosing him anyway. And he learned to let me in during moments of vulnerability, to trust that I wouldn't leave when things got hard or when remnants of his former life surfaced. We were building something real from the ashes of violence, fragile and imperfect, but undeniably ours. 6 months after the warehouse and the federal raids that had remade our world, Agent Chen called to inform me officially that the Crawford case was closed. 47 indictments handed down, and Robert Crawford himself facing 3 consecutive life sentences for racketeering, attempted murder, and a list of charges so long, Chen said it took the prosecutor 20 minutes just to read them in court. And my testimony had been instrumental according to the assistant district attorney, who sent a formal letter thanking me for my courage and cooperation. Alexander's cooperation had earned him what Chen called a clean slate on paper, immunity granted for his assistance in dismantling Crawford's organization and providing evidence that led to 8 additional arrests, though his reputation remained complicated in ways that showed in the careful distance some business associates maintained, and the occasional news article that referred to his alleged criminal past, even as he built something entirely legitimate. He had transitioned into private security and logistics consulting, using skills honed in criminal enterprise to advise corporations on supply chain protection and risk assessment, and the money was less obscene than what he'd made controlling territory and demanding tribute. But it was honest, and that mattered to him more than I'd expected. I received a promotion at the museum, appointed lead curator for a major exhibition on Byzantine art and trade routes that would open in 14 months, and Director Harrison told me during the promotion meeting that my dedication and scholarship had always been exemplary, entirely unaware that 6 months ago I'd been trapped between warring criminal organizations and had brought the FBI into a mafia conflict. Lucy was 8 months sober, the longest she'd been clean since her gambling addiction had started 4 years earlier, and watching her rebuild her life with painful slowness, attending meetings and working as a barista and slowly repairing relationships she'd damaged, filled me with a pride that sometimes brought tears during our weekly dinners. One evening in late October, Alexander suggested dinner at Aurelio, the exclusive restaurant where we'd first met under circumstances neither of us could have predicted, and I recognized the full circle nature of the moment as we were seated at the same table where he'd once told me I was under his protection and my sister owed dangerous people money I couldn't repay. He was nervous, uncharacteristically uncertain in a way that showed in how he adjusted his cufflinks twice and how his usual commanding presence seemed softened by something almost like fear. And when the server had taken our order and left us alone, he took my hand across the white tablecloth and told me I'd given him something he thought impossible for someone with his history and his choices, a future beyond violence and survival, a reason to want to be better than the man his father had raised him to become. He produced a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, his hands steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes, and inside was a ring, simple and elegant, a single diamond on a platinum band that caught the candlelight and threw tiny rainbows across the table. He asked me to marry him, to choose this complicated life with him permanently, to accept that his past would always cast shadows, but to believe that our future could be built in light. And I saw the fear of rejection in his face, this man who had commanded criminal empires and faced down rivals without flinching, now terrified that I might say no. My answer came through tears and laughter, the yes caught in my throat before I could speak it clearly, and I said it again, yes, always yes, choosing him and us, and the imperfect, beautiful reality we'd built from chaos and violence and unexpected love. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late November, when the estate grounds had transformed into a landscape of amber and crimson, the ancient oaks lining the drive dropping leaves that crunched under the feet of the 23 guests who comprised our entire wedding party, small and private exactly as we both wanted, no spectacle or press or society photographers to turn our union into gossip column fodder, just Lucy and Thomas, and a handful of people who knew our story and had stood by us through the chaos that had brought us here. I wore a simple dress, ivory silk, that fell to my ankles without embellishment or train, elegant in its restraint, and when I walked across the lawn toward where Alexander stood, beneath an arbor wound with late autumn roses, I saw his expression shift into something that stole my breath, wonder and possession, and a tenderness that made my eyes sting with tears I refused to let fall until after the vows. He wore a dark suit, no tuxedo, looking exactly like himself rather than some formal version for public consumption, and when I reached him and took his hands, I felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told me he was as overwhelmed as I was by the enormity of what we were promising. The officiant, a retired judge who owed Alexander a favor from years past, but had become a genuine friend during the legitimization process, kept the ceremony brief and intimate. But when it came time for vows, we'd written our own, and Alexander's voice was rough with emotion as he promised to protect and cherish and trust me with the broken parts of himself he'd hidden from the world for 35 years, to build a life worthy of the second chance I'd given him, to love me through whatever complications and dangers his past might bring into our future. My own vows came through a throat tight with feeling, promising to stand beside him through the gray morality and difficult choices, to trust his judgment even when I disagreed with his methods, to love all of him, including the parts forged in violence and necessity, to choose him every day for the rest of my life. When he kissed me after the judge pronounced us married, it was tender and full of promise, a kiss that tasted of relief and joy, and the desperate gratitude of two people who knew exactly how close they'd come to losing each other before they'd ever really begun. The reception unfolded on the terrace where months ago he'd almost kissed me before pulling away, now transformed with tiny lights strung through the pergola and tables covered in cream linens and centerpieces of roses and eucalyptus, intimate and warm as the November afternoon faded into evening. Lucy gave a toast that left half the guests in tears, talking about second chances and the sister who'd never given up on her even when she'd given up on herself, about watching me fall in love with a man who seemed all wrong but turned out to be exactly right, about family being the people who stand with you when the world goes dark. Thomas, serving as Alexander's best man with obvious pride, delivered a toast that started with jokes about how a museum curator had tamed the untamable, how Alexander had been transformed from the most dangerous man in the city to someone who now attended gallery openings and fundraiser galas. But his voice grew serious as he said what everyone in attendance could see, that we had saved each other in ways that went far beyond the dramatic rescue at the warehouse, that we'd given each other reasons to become better than we'd been. As the evening deepened and guests drifted between conversation and dancing to music played by a string quartet Alexander had hired, he found me standing at the terrace railing looking out over the grounds that had once felt like a prison and now felt like home. And he took my hand and led me inside and up the stairs to our bedroom, the one we'd been sharing for 4 months now, but that tonight felt transformed by the weight of vows and promises and legal bonds that made permanent what had begun in chaos. He carried me over the threshold in a gesture so traditionally romantic that I laughed, calling him sentimental, and he set me down with infinite care and framed my face with hands scarred from violence, but gentle in their touch, hands that had done terrible necessary things, but held me like I was something precious and breakable. He told me I was his redemption, his North Star, the home he'd never had in 35 years of survival and violence, and I told him he was my unexpected miracle, the safety I'd stopped believing existed, the heart I'd learned to trust despite every rational reason not to. We came together with the desperate tenderness of people who knew exactly how easily this could have been lost, how many moments of choice and chance had led to this bedroom and this night, and this life we were building together. Outside the windows, the world continued with all its complications and dangers. Federal monitoring, and old associates who still called seeking favors, and the reality that Alexander's past would always cast shadows we'd have to navigate. But here in this moment, with his heartbeat steady beneath my palm and his arms solid around me, and the future stretching ahead full of ordinary days and extraordinary love, we were simply Eleanor and Alexander, two wounded people who'd found each other in darkness and chosen to walk into the light together. And it wasn't a fairy tale ending with everything resolved and perfect, but it was something infinitely better, something real and hard-won and entirely ours.